Hey guys, so this week it marks the 1 year anniversary of me going full time on this channel. So as a bit of a, I guess you could say a little bit of a celebration, I'm going to do 3 videos this week. Today I want to talk about tanks. Wednesday I'll talk about how to be neutral when it comes to history and sources and stuff like that. And then on Friday I'm going to talk about how I have the energy to do so much work, because that's apparently one of the questions. So let's crack on with the first question of today. So the legend himself, Potential History, who is a patron, has asked, what's your favourite tank in an operational sense, and what's your favourite in an aesthetic sense? Do you think there is a tank that can be pointed to as the best of the war? Curious to hear your opinions personally and based on what you've read. So in an operational sense, I'll do that one first. I think probably the Panzer IV. And the reason is because right from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, you have Panzer IVs, right? It's something that goes throughout the whole war. It also starts off with the shorter barrel 75mm gun, but even in that sort of sense, it still can take out enemy infantry and anti-tank guns and all that other things. It's pretty solid as a machine. I know it varies. It gets a better gun towards the middle of the war and so on, but no matter what time period it is, a Panzer IV is pretty respectable. It is a bit out of date by 44, 45, but it's very respectable, and it ticks most of the boxes that you would probably say: armor, mobility, firepower, for the period of time. And so I would probably say the Panzer IV overall. It's either that or the T-34 or possibly the Sherman, but I would probably say the Panzer IV overall. Favourite in a aesthetic sense, though, it's going to have to be something like Tiger 2. It just looks awesome. It just looks awesome. And do I think there's a tank that can be pointed out as the best of the war? Not really, because it depends on your own personal opinions. And yeah, I mean, I would probably suggest it's probably a Sherman, T-34, Panzer IV, something like that. But I think it goes down to the person, what they personally think and how they interpret that. Because the thing is, like, any one of those machines, they all have flaws. So if you look at the T-34, yes, very, very good. Well, overall, it's pretty good. But in action, especially because I've done a lot of reading on Stalingrad recently, in action at Stalingrad or around Stalingrad, T-34 not doing so well, because they usually got separated from the infantry and then destroyed. So yeah, good tank or not, is it the best of the war? Well, no, not if they don't use it right. The Sherman, good overall, but pretty tall, so you can shoot them a lot of, there's a lot of them though, which is good. But again, there's flaws in it. So, and the thing is, you can't really say something like, as I say, the Tiger 2 or something, because there's just not enough of them. They're not reliable. There's a lot of problems. Logistically, they're a nightmare, especially for the Germans late war. So it's like, okay, maybe it's good in combat, maybe arguably, but is it the best in the war? Maybe not. And I don't think there isn't one tank where you could go, that's flawless, or that's so much further ahead of the rest, or yeah, there's no doubt, right? The fact that this question even exists, if there was any doubt, you wouldn't be asking it. So, in my opinion, I don't think there is a best tank of the war, because it really depends on what you're talking about. If you think best tank of 1940, I'd probably say the Matilda II, because it annihilated the Italian army in North Africa, right? That's pretty good. If you say best tank of, I don't know, Stalingrad, it's probably going to be a Panzer IV or a T-34, because it just is. But then later in the war, 1945, Panzer IV, T-34, probably not the best. So it really depends on which era of the war. So if you're doing the whole thing, I don't know. I don't think you can actually really do it, if I'm honest. Potential History, with his 200,000 odd subscribers, probably doesn't need this, but I will link to his channel in the description. Christopher Whitmer said, TIK, what criteria do you use to determine what a good tank is? Military History Visualized, with the curator of the Panzer Museum, came out with a video saying the classic 3 pillars are too general, those being firepower, armour and mobility. Also, if I could sneak a second one in, what is your favourite fighter and bomber of World War II? So I think I've said about the fighter before, and I'm pretty certain I said the Hurricane because my excuse was that it was made of wood, and that just shows typical Britishness. It's like no wonder our car industry went under, because we made everything made of wood, right? You don't do a proper job. Let's use sellotape and string, okay? So I'm saying the Hurricane. Now, people got annoyed with me when I said this. I'm not going to explain myself anymore. I'm just going to leave it like that and keep those people annoyed. So that's how I'm going to play that one. And as far as the bomber, I'm tempted to say something like the Stuka, but I'm actually going to say the Flying Fortress because it's pretty big and cool. And yeah, that makes sense, to be honest. I'm not really a fighter, or I'm not really a plane guy, to be fair. So that's that. But more importantly, your tank question. So yeah, so the classic sort of thing is to say firepower, armour and mobility. Now, let's just stick with that for a second and just look at the Tiger 1, which is meant to be an amazing tank. So firepower, yeah, Tiger 1, plenty of firepoer with the 18mm gun, so that's good. Armour, arguably pretty good, at least when it was introduced, and then maybe not so much later on, but okay, we'll say it's good. And then mobility, well, not so good. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad though, right? So arguably you could say Tiger 1, great tank. And then when you look at the Sherman, firepower, I mean, it's okay, but it's not a great gun. Armour, it's okay, but not great. Mobility, pretty good. So it's like, oh, only 1 out of 3? So I guess the Tiger is better, okay? And you can do this with any other tank of the war, and you look at firepower, armor, mobility, and what it does, it skews it, because if you're just looking at the tank in combat, you've missed half the picture. And even that, firepower, armor, and mobility don't cover everything in combat. They certainly don't cover everything in combat. So here's what I'm going to just read off the list that I've got that I would probably use to classify this. So we've got firepower, armor, mobility, reliability. Does it break down a lot? Fuel consumption. If it sucks a lot of gas and you've not got any, that's not good, is it? Production. How many are produced? Turret size, because that's very important. Integration with other arms. Are you using your tank correctly with infantry, artillery, anti-tank guns, Stukas, whatever? Yes or no? And then the psychological impact. So let's look at the Tiger 1 again. So firepower, yeah. Armour, yeah. Mobility, no. Reliability, no. Fuel consumption, no. Production, no. Like there was only like 1,000 or 1,300, something like that. Only a couple of thousand Tigers produced ever. Turret size, I think the Tiger's okay with that. Integration with other arms, arguable, but I would say no. And if you look at Villas Bocage, how the heck did that even happen? Like, how did that even happen? Like, Michael Whitman goes out on his own, in his own tank, and faces like a battalion of enemy, and somehow there's no infantry support, no air support, no anti-tank support. How the heck did he not get taken out at all? It doesn't make any sense. Like, were none of the British armed with bazookas? Were none of them armed with anti-tank guns? Well, there's no tanks in the area. Like, what on earth were they thinking? Like, what were they doing, right? Now, I haven't studied it particularly, but it's just like, how? Right? Because in normal circumstances, that tank would not have lasted 5 minutes. But somehow in this one instance, it does manage to last. But anyway, so yeah, integration with other arms, arguably not. And then psychological impact, okay. So in that case, you got, I don't know, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 9. That's not that good, is it? When you look at the Sherman, so firepower, armor. So armor, yeah, okay. Mobility, very good. Actually, let's not say armor. That's because people think it's weak. It's not, but let's go with that. So mobility, yes. Reliability, yes. Fuel consumption, yes. Production, yes. Turret size is good, I think. Integration with other arms, yes. Psychological impact, no. So you've got 6 out of 9. Well, it's a better tank. It's a better tank than the Tiger 1, at least. Let's do another one. Let's do Panzer IV. Okay, let's say early war or mid-war. Firepower. Regardless of the length of the barrel, it's still a very good gun. It's a 75mm. It can still do a lot of damage at long ranges, and not only just against tanks, but against infantry and anti-tank guns. So firepower, yes. Armor, yes. Very good for its time. Mobility, yes. Reliability, yeah, I guess so, arguably. Or better than the later war tanks. Fuel consumption, yeah. Production, yeah. One of the most produced tanks that the Germans had. Turret size, I believe is okay. I think it's a 3-man turret. Integration with other arms, yes, at least in the early war. Psychological impact, arguable, but you could probably say yes, because the early war panzers had a reputation. So it's like, oh, top marks, maybe 8 of them out of 9. It's like, okay, so that's a good tank then. Same with the Panzer III. Do the same with the Panzer III. Okay, it's got maybe less armor and maybe less firepower, but arguably it's the same sort of thing. Most of those, it's doing pretty well. So actually, you could probably argue that the Panzer IV and Panzer III were better than the Tiger. I would probably say that, if I'm honest. And if you look at the Panther, firepower, yes, it's okay for its time, at least 75mm. Armor, very good. I think it's actually better than the Tiger. Mobility, as far as I'm aware, it's pretty good. Reliability, very poor. Fuel consumption, high, because it's a huge machine. If you've ever stood next to a Panther, it's like, whoa, compared to like a Panzer IV. Production, not great. It's not too bad, but it's not great. Turret size is good. Integration with other arms, arguable. And psychological impact, I'm not so sure anyone was like, oh my god, it's a Panther. Like Tiger, yeah, not necessarily much of a Panther. So, but yeah, okay, we'll give it that. So it's like, again, it's like, what, 5 out of 9? So there's a problem, and this is the point that you're like, I would probably say out of all this list, what's most important is the integration with other arms, and the reliability and the fuel consumption. That kind of links into one big thing, which is logistics. So with those two things, you might not even get your tank to the beginning of the battlefield, right? So if you look at the Soviet tanks, especially at Dubno, like a third of them break down before they even get to the battlefield. So it's like, what's the point of having good firepower, armor, mobility if your tank doesn't even reach the battlefield? So there's a lot going on. Let's do one more. Let's do the Crusader tank for the British. Okay, so firepower, nah. Armor, no. Mobility, yes. Reliability, no. Fuel consumption, it's probably okay. Production, not really. I guess it's okay, but not really. Turret size, ooh, I don't remember. It's either a 2 or 3-man turret. We'll give it okay, because I don't know. Integration with other arms, no. Look at Crusader. That was the worst thing they did. Like, send the tanks off alone, on their own. I'm sure it'll be fine. So no. Psychological impact, not very much. Actually, no, let's do one more, because actually, I've just thought. So Crusader tank, not so good. Matilda 2. Firepower, no, it's alright, but not really. Armor, great. Mobility, not so great. Reliability is okay with the Matilda 2. Fuel consumption, as far as I'm aware, is okay. Production, it's not great. Turret size was fine, I think. Might be 2-man. Integration with other arms, pretty good, because it was an infantry tank rather than a cruiser. So I think the infantry cooperated together. Psychological impact, not so much for the Germans, but for the Italians, this was devastating. It was a devastating weapon because most of the Italian guns couldn't take it out. They could immobilize it, but they couldn't really take it out. So it was actually really good. So if you look at that, again, it's like, oh, actually, the Matilda 2 is a better tank overall than the cruiser, the Crusader. Now, this is arguable because the 88mm, when they got there, it was like they could take out the Matilda, and they could take them out so far. So it was good until the 88 appeared. But even so, you can still see actually there are some tanks that are better than other tanks. And even in that sort of situation, the Matilda 2 actually does better than the Tiger. Although, if they went up against each other, probably, if they got to the battlefield, you'd probably say the Tiger would take out the Matilda, which is true, but would the Tiger have got to the battlefield, and if there was a lot of Matildas, because I think they made more Matildas than Tigers, I might be wrong. But yeah, the point is, you can see, certainly for its era, the Matilda 2 was a better tank than the late war Tigers, because overall it's got more. So that's how I would look at it. Because a lot of people, I think they just think, it's tank versus tank. And that's not the case. That's absolutely not the case. But we'll talk about that in the next question. So Kevin Dragos said, the T-34 is often considered one of, if not the, greatest tanks of all time, but do you think it's overrated? People always talk about its sloped armour and how shells bounced off, but what they don't say is that mostly happened in the first year of the invasion, when the Germans mostly had light 37mm anti-tank guns that weren't made to penetrate that much armour anyway. Within a year, the Germans had several guns that could pierce the T-34's frontal armour easily. It had bad sights, terrible situational awareness, and a turret so cramped it didn't have a dedicated commander. This isn't to say it was a bad tank, but it seems the main reason for its success was the same as the Sherman's, which was that it was produced in overwhelming numbers. So if we go back to the list again, so firepower, armour, mobility, etc. So firepower, it's pretty good actually, 75mm gun. Certainly when it gets upgraded, even better. So we'll give it a yes. Armour, yes, apparently. Mobility, yeah. Reliability, yeah, as far as we're aware. Fuel consumption's fine. Production's great. Turret size, I'm sure the 85 had a 3-man turret, so it depends on the one. So maybe early, not so much. Later on, better. Integration with other arms, that's the killer. That's the killer one. Psychological impact, probably. But the integration with other arms, that's the killer, because that's what they didn't do. That's where they got it wrong. This has been my argument all along. The Soviets didn't use their tanks correctly. They had a ton of tanks, and they went, go, race off towards the German anti-tank guns. I'm sure it'll be fine. All right, and this is the point, like you're saying about the 37mm anti-tank gun. You don't need to pierce the armour of a tank and destroy the tank in order to knock it out. All you need to do is immobilise it and wait, because what are the men going to do inside? Starve? Like, there's only so long they can actually hold out for. And so if you send tanks across an open field into the enemy's anti-tank guns, into their infantry who are armed with mines and satchel charges and all this other stuff, and grenades that can blow the tracks off, and all you're going to do is have your tank immobilized. They're going to be taken out by, you can bring the anti-tank guns around it maybe. A tank in the middle of a field, if you don't go into that field, you're not going to get shot at. And even if the tank is in the field and you're an infantryman, you can get around the side. If you approach it from two sides at once, what's the turret going to do? Fire both ways? It doesn't. There's so many ways, and you see this. People have said this before in the comments. You see it so much in the Syrian war and modern conflicts. They send their tanks in alone, no infantry support, and the enemy infantry blow them up, and it's like, oh, why is that happening? And it's because there's so many ways to take out a tank. A lot of the tanks in the early war, especially the Soviets, broke down before they got to the battlefield and had to be abandoned. The Germans did the same, not quite to the same extent, but yeah, just travelling so many miles just wore out the tracks, wore out the engines, especially for the Germans, wore out the engines. So all you need to do, in a lot of ways, is damage the tank or disable it, immobilise it, wait till it runs out of ammunition, or blow it up with close support weaponry. So, do I think the T-34 is overrated? Not necessarily. I think it's a very good tank overall. As I just said, it's got most of the thing. The problem is that they failed so much with the integration of arms that they basically rendered all the other stuff useless. Because you can probably get away, if you didn't have great, let's say, fuel consumption, you can probably get around that if you've got good logistics. you can't really, but if you're sending your tanks off alone, they're going to get slaughtered. And that's just what happened. I mean, even in Stalingrad, these T-34s, there was loads of T-34s at Stalingrad, around, not necessarily in the city, and they just got wiped out. And I've been reading Panzerkrieg, it's behind me, Panzerkrieg by Jason DeMark, and just so many times you just hear, like, the Soviet infantry did not support the tank. The tanks went off alone. Or the infantry got hit by artillery and put their heads down, and then the tanks just sat there and got blown to pieces. And that happened so many times that the German infantry were just having a field day, because all you're doing is separating them. Like, combined arms warfare says work together. Once you separate them into different parts, you can take them out. Rock beats scissors, paper beats rock. You can take it out using whatever you need to do. So T-34 is a good tank, but if you don't use it correctly, and if you don't have all the other stuff working together, that's when it goes wrong. And the Germans in the early war had this down to a T, at least in the Panzer divisions, and the motorized divisions. But then, as the war progressed, they seemed to fail, which is weird. And it's a case of, why did they do so well in the early war? Why did they do so badly in the later war? And we talked about the tanks, like the Tiger was not designed the same way as the early war tanks, so maybe that's a factor. But let's talk about that in the third question. So John Christian Lewis says, I'm very interested about US tankers. My grandfather was in the 3rd Armour Division. I think he later says the 2nd, not the 3rd, but whatever. And his comments book The Narrative of German Invincibility. My question is, my grandfather told me that the German armour they encountered was quickly dealt with, and that the Germans only had the advantage in ambush and prepared defensive positions. He also told me that the main threat was anti-tank guns and infantry anti-tank. His thoughts on panzers: they were great in a defensive setting, in all others a liability. Your thoughts would be appreciated. He's talking about the late war, so 1944-45. So that's important because, again, it's like, oh, a Tiger. And what did we say before? The Tiger's not got half of the stuff. And what did the Germans prioritise? Firepower and armour over pretty much everything else. Maybe psychological impact. Over everything else, they prioritised firepower and armour. Not mobility, Panther arguably, but not mobility. Not even reliability. Not even fuel consumption. Not even production. It was firepower and armour. And so what you have, how can I put this? It's kind of like what the Romans kind of did. A little bit out of my depth, able to go with it. So, because I've started. So the Romans in the early Empire era, or even earlier than that, they had a shield and a sword, right? A short sword. So they had to get in close in order to kill. When you get to the late, approaching the fall of the Empire, they changed, or they seem to have changed, to shield and spear. And that's a little bit different because it's more like stay away sort of thing, right? And it kind of shows a difference in doctrine. That doesn't mean they're not very good, it's just a little bit different. And it's kind of like, stay away from me because I don't really want you to get close. And obviously a spear is actually pretty good anyway, but in this case, it's kind of similar. So early in the war, it's like, well, we have okay armour or good armour for the time. We have good firepower or okay for the time. We have great mobility. We can get in. We can get stuck in. We can destroy it. And oftentimes they did. Look at Crusader. It was just a complete mess. But the Panzers constantly had the advantage. When you get to the late war, it's kind of different. The firepower's there. They emphasise that. They emphasise the armour. And it's kind of the same thing. It's like, spear and stay away, right? And that's kind of the mentality. Because they're on the defensive. That's basically what it is. They've gone, we don't need fast, encircling panzers anymore because we can't even do that anymore. We've not got the oil and whatever else. The logistics have gone. The reliability's gone. Everything's fallen apart. It's the end of days. Gotterdammerung. So they've actually emphasised probably the two things that they could get away with, which is firepower and armour. So that then says, actually, we are better in defensive, because if you think of let's say a panther or a tiger, and you're in, let's say, behind a bush or something, or light cover, or even big cover, you're in behind a defensive position, you're ambushing the enemy, you've got a big gun, so you can fire massive distances, you can probably hit 2 or 3 tanks before they get anywhere near. That gives you an advantage, whereas the Panzer IV, not so much. You're going to have to get closer. And not only that, the Panther, and maybe the Tiger II, not rather than the Tiger I, but the Panther's got great armour, so unless you've got a 76mm, I'm not even sure they could do it. Oh yeah, they could do it if they hit the turret of the tank in a certain way. But, you need a big gun, or you need to get around the sides or whatever to actually penetrate that frontal armour. So you need to get closer to the tanks, and you need to get that distance done. So, but the problem is as well, so the Germans late war don't integrate their arms anymore. And I haven't figured out why. It might be because there's a lack of infantry. There's just a lack of manpower. So they're emphasising machine over man. I don't know. I haven't fully figured that out yet, but that's the way it kind of seems to be. So what you end up with is like that Michael Whitmer scenario where, well, his is an exception, not the rule. I think most of the time they are sending these tanks in on their own without infantry or very little infantry, without anti-tank guns, without air support, obviously, which is just the same as what the Soviets did in the early war. And then they're like, why is it not working? Why is Blitzkrieg not working? And it's like, because you've lost all the advantages you had in the early war by sending these massive, heavily armoured and good gun machines, but you've got no support with them, and so they're just getting taken out in penny packets, which is exactly what the Soviets had happened to them. So, yeah, I think as well it's that integration bit, and so they're probably less likely then to then start attacking more. And then when they do attack, they fail. So they're like, oh no, we better put these in defensive positions. So I think that is is a big thing. And you're saying about anti-tank guns and obviously infantry as well. Infantry, you have to get close to have the Panzerschrecks and the Panzerfaust actually work. It's not too bad, but you do need to get relatively close for them to work, whereas anti-tank guns could take them out quite far. So let's say a 75mm anti-tank gun, this or a Stug, these have advantages over tanks because they're quite low compared to a tank. If you think of a Sherman, it's like, all right then, that's going to get hit. And if you think of it, if you've seen a Panther or a Tiger, these are huge machines. When I went to Bovington last year, they had the Tiger room, and these things are massive and they're impressive when you look at them. Then you stand next to them and it's like, whoa, how do they climb up them? They're quite big and they're quite imposing and impressive, and everybody was like, oh yeah, it's a Tiger room, and everybody went just to see the Tigers and not really that much the other machines, which is a shame. But the point is that they're quite big. So these things can be seen for quite a distance. And so it's quite hard to hide a Tiger. You can do it, obviously, in a wood or something, or behind a barn. But, infantry, anti-tank, you can just sit one guy in a foxhole or a trench with a Panzerfaust, pretty decent. When you've got an anti-tank gun, you can hide them because they're quite low down. You can hide them behind bushes and whatever else. So they've got more, I think, in a sense, they've got more flexibility. And even a Stug, it's only the body of a Panzer 3 or 4, depending what it is. So they're pretty low down. So you can hide them more. And they might be only good on the defensive, but that's the point. So these weapons are actually pretty good on the defensive, and I've said this all along, you need to integrate your arms, whereas the tanks, not so much. They provide flexibility, but they don't, because they're unreliable and break down all the time, and the fuel consumption is terrible. So it's like, oh, we better not send the Panzers this way because we might run out of fuel. And you actually see that at Stalingrad, actually, quite a bit. because they're at the ends of their logistical chains. It's like, oh, we better not move the panzers over here because we'll consume too much fuel, so therefore we've got to keep them in this area, which then leads to problems. So it's just like that in the later war. And when you see the Battle of the Bulge, or even a lot of the battles in Normandy, and my video on Operation Doppelkopf as part of the Kurland series, when you see this, it's like, wait a second, like Doppelkopf, you have 400 tanks, panzers. You have 400 panzers going against enemy infantry formations, and they go nowhere. They go like 7 miles or whatever, or 12 kilometers, and you're like, how? How did you not? And then you go, oh, it's because they've got lack of infantry, lack of air support, lack of anti-tank guns, and so on and so forth, and so the enemy just take them out. And, you know, your grandfather, hopefully, you know, his memory was good enough that he's telling the truth here. And I think I'm coming to this conclusion as well. I think it's true. I think this is the conclusion that I'm coming to. This is how I'm thinking now. It's like these big cats, you know, tigers and panthers at the end of the war, they've not got that advantage that the early war tanks had. And I'm not saying, because as I say, if you compare a late war tank to like an early war opposite tank, like the Crusader, where it's high mobility but no armor and not a great gun, which is better? Probably the Tiger overall. However, if you get the mobility and production and the reliability and the fuel consumption and the 3-man turret or whatever, if you get all that right, you get a better tank overall, even if the gun's not great, even if the armor's not great. So that's the way I'm kind of seeing it. And yeah, I don't think the German invincibility at the end of the war is as much as it's kind of made out to be. Because don't forget, you know, you're saying about they're only good on the defensive, the Germans. Well, so are the Allies. Villers and Picard aside, the Allies have got anti-tank guns. The Allies have got infantry anti-tank, Pits and bazookas. The Allies have got Wolverines, the anti-tank guns, tank destroyers. And they've got Fireflies. Not that I'm saying they're a good tank, but you get the point. It's like, oh, look. So when they do fight the Battle of the Bulge, okay, yeah, sure, at beginning, a couple of US divisions don't do so well. But once the Allies move the better divisions into the area, let's say, or get the numbers in the area, there's a problem now. Same with the Soviet side. They've now got bazookas and anti-tank guns. So the Germans lose their ability to break through the enemy, which they could in the early war, because the early war Allies and Soviets don't have anti-tank guns and infantry anti-tank to the same extent. They do, but not nowhere near the same extent as they do later. And they lose that, but they also then lose the ability to defend, because the Allies have got the advantage, because they do have the tanks, they do have the infantry, they do have the anti-tank, they do have the air support. So these good tanks that the Germans supposedly have don't match the reality. You know, they can't match it. Most of the German divisions are not tank divisions anyway. They're not panzer divisions. Most of the German divisions are foot infantry divisions. They're not even motorized. And, you know, there's that famous, was it the general who got captured and said, "Where are all your horses?" Right? Because the Allies didn't use horses because they had they had, except for the paratrooper divisions and so on, they had motorized units. Well, the Germans didn't have that. They had horses and feet. And they didn't even have that towards the end, because they ran out of rubber. So it's just I'm not convinced either. And I'm not saying that the Germans didn't fight hard, and I'm not saying that there wasn't formations that were elite and didn't integrate their arms and so on. It just depends on the situation. But when you think about the whole picture, and you don't just look at the tanks themselves, when you look at the infantry and the anti-tank guns as well, and the air support, and you look at the whole picture, that's when you realise, oh actually, yeah, no, the Germans didn't have this invincibility thing. There's chinks in the armour of it. And this is what this is the conclusion I came to early on, and I'm trying to convince everybody else. So hopefully if I repeat it enough, and enough people see these types of videos, they'll go, oh yes, that makes more sense now, rather than tank versus tank, which just doesn't, no.